Welcome everyone to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available in podcast form. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. In the 2016 election, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. So key, in fact, were they in his victory that many Americans and many Christians, both here and abroad, were shocked, if not outraged, that our faith was being used to support the candidacy of someone who was so blatantly racist, a white supremacist, misogynist, and xenophobe, whose actual interest in Christianity was probably nil. But it all has to do with something called Christian nationalism. And here to explain what that is Andrew Seidel. He is a constitutional attorney with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He's also the author of the book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Andrew Seidel, thank you for being on the broadcast today.
Oh, thank you for hosting me, SJ. It is a pleasure.
Now, before we get into the meat of the issue, I wanted to ask you something very important. How many basketballs would it take to fill the Grand Canyon?
It's a great question. Do you want to take a guess first and see how close you can get?
Is it into the trillions?
It is well into the trillions. The highest guess I've ever had is 1 trillion. So I will actually give you the supremacy of having the closest guess since you made it plural, but it's about 100 trillion, 200 billion. And it's a little bit of a fudge because that's really the amount of space that's missing that would in the Grand Canyon. So, the amount of rock and dirt that would fill those basketballs would also fill the Grand Canyon, give or take probably a little bit.
Well,
yeah, 100 trillion, 200 billion basketballs.
I've always been dying to ask that question. For those of you who are listening and wondering what we are talking about, it's, I guess, a little bit of an inside joke. You read Andrew's book, and he was actually a tour guide at the Grand Canyon at one point.
Yeah, before law school, that's what I was doing. Great job, lots of fun.
I imagine it was a lot of fun. Hard to tear yourself away from all that natural beauty. It was. Well, let's get back to the book. Judeo-Christian principles or values, the founding myth, those are some words or phrases that you use frequently in the book. What exactly are we talking about with them?
Yeah, overall we are talking about Christian nationalism. And if you had to kind of sum that up, it'd be, do we have a government of the people, for the people, and by the people? Or is ours a government of the Christians, for the Christians, and by the Christians? That's really the battle that we're in right now. And it's not just Christians. It's really conservative Christians. It's the quote-unquote right kind of Christian. So America's in this desperate fight against Christian nationalism, which is a political theology that is an existential threat to our republic. So that is why I wrote The Founding Myth, to fight back against this threat. And Christian nationalism it's not a scholarly debate about whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation, so that's part of it. It's a sinister exclusionary movement, right? The goal is to redefine America according to the Christian nationalist identity, and then to reshape our law accordingly. And at its most basic level, though, Christian nationalism is the belief that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and more importantly, that we've strayed from that foundation, right? That we've gotten away from our godly roots. And they use that language of return to justify all manner of public policy, sometimes hateful, sometimes downright evil public policy. And we saw this really take hold with Trump. Donald Trump rode this undercurrent of Christian nationalism in the most powerful office in the history of the world, and then started using it to legislate and to justify all manner of public policy.
Right. You say in your book that the single most accurate predictor of whether a person voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election was Not religion, not wealth or education or even political party. It was the belief that the U.S. is and should be a Christian nation, that Christian nationalism is more important to these people than religion, political party, or any other factor in American life. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it belies that, the 81% of white evangelicals that you cited in the beginning, that's the number that sticks with so many people from that election. And it should, because it's shocking, and because people know what an evangelical believes, because they're so vocal about their beliefs and so involved in what they call the culture wars. But really, a better predictor was Christian nationalism. This is not my own research. This is research done by two experts, sociologists, Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, who also have a book out specifically about sort of the demographics and studying the demographics of Christian nationalism, called Taking America Back for God. And so that is based on their research. And what I try to do more in my book is to really refute the idea that we're a Christian nation, push back on it, and really to destroy and bury what I consider to be a deeply un-American political ideology. And it's not only the best predictor of a Trump voter for the 2016 election. We're still waiting to see what the impact was on 2020. I imagine it's going to be pretty similar. But again, it's infecting all of our public policy under the Trump administration. People tend to forget that the Muslim ban actually is a great example of Christian nationalism. People tend to forget not only did it ban immigration from Muslim-majority countries, but it also actually favored immigration for certain Christians. The child separation policy at the border is another prime example of Christian nationalism being written into our public policy. Then Attorney General Jeff Sessions justified that policy of ripping kids from their parents' arms and throwing them in cages by citing Romans 13. And he learned to do that in the White House Bible study. And it goes on and on. I mean, the opposition to LGBTQ equality, right? The opposition to reproductive rights. It is interwoven into the conservative politics. It's really sort of this unholy alliance, this incestuous marriage between conservative Christianity and conservative politics.
You talk about something called Project Blitz. What
was
that? What did it set out, or what is it setting out to do?
Yeah, so Project Blitz is an explicitly Christian nationalist push. It was organized by several explicitly Christian nationalist organizations, including Wall Builders, which is an organization formed by David Barton, the National Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, and they set out to essentially do what the goal of Christian nationalism is, which is to reshape the American identity, and then in the image of Christian nationalism, and then reshape our law accordingly. And they actually did this using state legislatures, and their handbook was leaked. So we actually have their handbook for how to do this. And they initially wanted to get the legislatures to pass laws that were seemingly ceremonial, celebrating, for instance, the influence of the Bible on American law and history. We'd get a week of that under Project Blitz. Celebrating "In God We Trust" is the national motto. Things like that don't seem like a big deal. They seem sort of ceremonial at first. And then after they pass those laws and kind of reshape what it means to be an American, then they start getting into the more sinister and exclusionary laws that would, for instance, at the top, give the right kind of Christian, deeply conservative Christian, a license to discriminate against LGBTQ people, for instance. And they did try to rebrand themselves, I should say, in all fairness. Project Blitz was the name they chose for themselves, and obviously it's a terrible name with awful historical connotations. And they stuck with it for a long time. I can't remember. I think they might have rebranded themselves as Freedom for All, I want to say, but they are now and forever henceforth known as Project Blitz from everybody who has heard of them. So I'm not changing.
Yeah. How successful have they been so far in passing this both on the local and national level?
Good question. Not terribly successful. There are organizations like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, American Atheists, got together with a number of other progressive and religious organizations and formed something called Blitz Watch to push back against each of these bills when they cropped up, and we were very successful in that. Project Blitz had a reasonable first year, but have not seen much success at all since then. And if anything, COVID has actually hamstrung them even more, mostly because state legislatures, at least those that are acting responsibly, are more focused on really important things like the pandemic and relief for citizens rather than talking about our national motto or getting the Bible or prayer back in the public schools. So they've not been very successful at all. I think their first year was the most successful, and they've declined ever since then.
Yeah, there've been a lot of so-called distractions, I guess, in that way. Now, if you were to set out to prove, and you do that in your book, that the U.S. is not a Christian nation, and that the founding fathers were not all Bible-thumping Christians, what facts would you have recourse to? What do you commonly cite as your evidence for that?
So what I tried to do in the book was really reconceptualize that argument, because it's not just about history, right? If it were just about history, you wouldn't see it infecting public policy. You wouldn't see Jeff Sessions going out there and talking about Christian nationalism and implementing public policy as Christian nationalism. It's about much more than history. So I kind of wanted to reconceptualize the argument a little bit. The very identity of the Christian nationalist depends on certain lies and myths, and it's things that everybody's heard before, right? Like, we are one nation under God, in God we trust. The Declaration of Independence references the Christian God 4 different times. You know, the founders were all evangelical Christians. All that stuff that our laws are based on the Ten Commandments, for instance, and all of that is not accurate. And without the historical cover that those lies give, their policy justifications begin to crumble, right? So without their commonwealth of lies and myths, their identity will wither and fade. So attacking those myths is actually really important because their entire political and ideological reality is actually incredibly weak and vulnerable because it's based on those historical distortions and lies. So we need those facts to fight back, but we also need better arguments. And that really was the purpose of the founding myth, to give everybody the facts, but they were kind of already available. So I want to give people better arguments. So it's not simply a refutation of the idea that we're a Christian nation. Instead, I went deeper and I asked, did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? And the answer to that is no, they didn't. And what you see, the more you compare America's founding principles to those Judeo-Christian principles, especially the ones that are central to Christian nationalism, you see sort of this fundamental disconnect, that the principles are thoroughly opposed to each other, that they have irreconcilable differences, and that's one of the reasons that founding fathers chose to divorce state and church. So, one of the ways that I like to phrase it is America will never be a Christian nation, because the moment it becomes a Christian nation, it will cease to be America. So really the argument that I'm making is that these are two conflicting systems with irreconcilable differences. And I don't think that argument is, I think it's a new argument, certainly, and I know it puts a lot of people, sets a lot of people, oh, really, wow, I've never, that they're a little taken aback, maybe. But let's take the Ten Commandments as an example, right? They begin, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. I mean, that's a divine commandment. It's central to Judeo-Christianity, and it is, to be blunt, un-American, right? The first commandment embodies principles that directly conflict with the principles on which the United States was founded.
It's commanding us to worship a particular specific deity.
Exactly, and no law can tell any American to worship a god, let alone which god. We are free to be godless, and a growing number of Americans are, or to worship every god from every holy book. And, the commandments continue on in this un-American vein, They prohibit the free expression and art, graven images. They prohibit free speech, taking the Lord's name in vain. They go on to sanction slavery twice. And a lot of people don't remember this, but the Ten Commandments even promise to punish innocent children to the third and fourth generation if parents are brazen enough to exercise the religious freedom that is guaranteed in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So, that's just kind of one example, and I think you could, and it's not just limited to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. You can go and make those comparisons throughout. So really what I'm trying to show is that there's just this fundamental disconnect between the two systems, that they have these irreconcilable differences. And really it's the American system that allowed a freedom of religion that allowed Christianity to flourish here in the United States.
Now, the catchphrase Judeo-Christian principles that we hear all the time, what does it really mean? Sometimes I want to stop politicians and say, what do you mean by that? What can you unpack that term for me? And where did it come from?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because I hate I hate using it, especially with audiences that are familiar with it, without my usual disclaimer, and I neglected to do that right here at the beginning.
Oh, it's okay.
So I appreciate you asking that. You're right to ask the question, because it's so rarely answered. Everybody is very vague about what a Judeo-Christian principle is, and I think it's difficult to pin down because it is something of a fabrication, a deliberate fabrication. I quote in the book, I believe it was a Jewish theologian who says that Judaism is Judaism because it rejects Christianity, and Christianity is Christianity because it rejects Judaism. So Judeo-Christian is sort of a nebulous, vague, slippery term because it's a political invention, not a scholarly description. So the first time we really see it starting to take hold, it was used before this, but we really see it sort of come to prominence after World War II, when the idea of Christian exclusivity was far too threatening. And it probably
because
really
of the Holocaust and
exactly. And it didn't really probably gain prominence until the fight against communism, when, some religion, any religion, would do. Eisenhower was probably the first president to use the term, and he did it when he was talking with this Soviet general in the early 1950s, and he said that the American form of government makes no sense unless it is founded on a deeply felt religious faith. And I don't care what it is. With us, of course, it's a Judeo-Christian concept. So in my mind, right, it is not a useful phrase. I think it's more of a sop, right? It's more of a fig leaf that is meant to avoid controversy and complaint. That's why we toss it around. It's meant to soften the edge of what is clearly an exclusionary movement, that is Christian nationalism.
So you make the statement that the two systems, America and Judeo-Christian values, differ and conflict to such a degree, and to put it bluntly, Christianity is un-American. That just to a lot of people would just seem so shocking, because we're so used to hearing this founding myth without really challenging it.
Yeah, it's meant to be something of a gut punch to wake the reader up. Previous books have offered gentle corrections to the Christian nationalist. Here's what history tells us, and here's what the founding fathers actually meant, and here's what the founding fathers actually said. But then they've kind of left it at that. But correction is not enough. Facts, sadly, are not enough. Pointing out errors is insufficient. So this book does that, but then it takes the next step, and it really does go on the offensive. It is meant to be an assault on the Christian nationalist identity. Not only are the Christian nationalists wrong, their beliefs and identity run counter to the ideals on which this nation was founded. So they truly are un-American. And to get more to the point, right? I mentioned earlier that we talked about the Ten Commandments being un-American, and I mentioned that it's not limited to just the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. You can compare Christianity and the American constitutional system, and it continues in that vein of conflict, right? The Bible venerates principles such as obedience and fear. The Constitution venerates freedom. The Bible teaches you to obey the rulers because they're ordained by God, Romans 13, which is what Jeff Sessions cited when he was talking about separating kids from their parents. Now, of course, in the COVID era, many of these conservative churches have changed there too. But under the American system, we the people give the rulers their power. We the people retain not just a right, but also a duty to rebel against totalitarian rulers, right? So during the American Revolution, there was English preachers and Tory preachers that were citing Romans 13 to say, look, we can't be rebelling against the king. And incidentally, I mean, the only governments that are in the Bible are monarchies, theocratic monarchies. There's no whiff of representative government anywhere in the Bible. Biblical justice is so severe and vicious that if it were implemented, it would violate the Constitution. And, this is maybe a little too biblical for a lot of people. So we can narrow it down to some of the core principles of Christianity. Hell is a central tenet of Christianity, conflicts with the Constitution on at least two major counts, both as a place of torture and eternal punishment. I cite a case in the book, a little bit tongue-in-cheek. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and the Supreme Court said that being stuck in a cell with a 5-pack-a-day smoker was cruel and unusual. So I think we could definitely say that hell was. Original sin's another example that's probably not a core principle of Christianity for many American Christians, but a good chunk it is. And that transgresses, the core presumption of American justice, that you are presumed innocent. But I think the biggest one, and the one that's the hardest for a lot of Christians to really reconcile personally, at least in my conversations that I've found, is that the repudiations of personal responsibility, like punishing innocent people and vicarious redemption, are really a biblical constant. And the biggest one is Jesus dying for our sins. That's the most prominent example. He was innocent, and somehow his punishment absolves others of wrongdoing. That's probably the central idea of Christianity, that Jesus died for your sins. And it's a complete abrogation of personal responsibility that's fundamentally at odds with our entire democratic, legal, and even our financial system. So again, you see this just sort of, in my mind, this fundamental conflict throughout, and that's what I'm trying to show in the book.
Now, I was reading a book recently, and I don't have the title in front of me. I'm sorry, I can't mention it, but it talks about when this founding myth came into being. Many people assume it was there from the beginning, but actually not. It was actually during the Depression, 1930s, with FDR's trying to push through legislation for depression relief, all this legislation that was effectively giving government more power and helping the poor and wealthy industrialists were alarmed, and they wanted to fight against this. They saw this as socialist, tyrannical. So they put forth this propaganda program, which started coining these phrases like Judeo-Christian, or Judeo-Christian values or whatever, as sort of buzzwords to get people to oppose FDR's program. Is there any other indication that that's true, or would you disagree with that?
No, I would not. So the book you're talking about is Kevin Cruz's book, One Nation Under God. So he's a Princeton historian. There's a lot of original research in that book. And Kevin was kind enough to review the chapter of the founding myth in which I talk about this and offer some insights. And I had to entirely rewrite it in light of his book, so I do agree with his overall premise. The only thing I guess I would add is that there have been other waves of Christian nationalism in American history. Certainly you don't see it at the founding, You do see some in sort of the 1830s time leading up to the Civil War. There's one. There's one, a small one during the Civil War. And there are a few others, but really sort of, I guess, we would call it the modern strain. And it certainly birthed a lot of the ideas that are currently popular in Christian nationalism came during that era that you were just talking about, and really leading up right through McCarthyism and the Cold War, before Americans got sick of the reign of witches, and sort of started rebelling against that, along with some friendly courts finally. But yes, so I do agree with Kevin Cruz's central thesis on that, and incorporated it into the chapter of the founding myth that deals with that as well.
Now, as I was reading your book, I had this sneaking feeling of, how much do you think things like systemic racism, white supremacy, xenophobia have to do with white nationalist claim of a Christian nation and Judeo-Christian, quote-unquote, Judeo-Christian values? Is it kind of a code? Is it a dog whistle type of situation?
Yeah, it is. It really, really is. The overlap between Christian nationalism and white nationalism, if you're looking at a Venn diagram, it looks more like a circle. It's certainly not exact, but there is, and I think this has been true historically too. It's not, in a lot of instances, we think of religion as leading the way on progress. And that view of history is tainted by modern religion. Historically, what really happens is religion gets dragged into modernity by secular movements and ideals. When it comes to progress, religion doesn't usually lead, it follows. And I cite Professor Mark Smith in the Founding Myth, who's done some excellent work in this area, and he likens it to the tail wagging the dog. And it seems counterintuitive, and I think people listening probably are like, no, that's not. But it only seems counterintuitive because religion later claims credit for that progress. So let's think about the historical opposition to divorce, to women's rights, to LGBTQ rights, to abolition and desegregation and civil rights. The stronger religious, theological, and biblical arguments were on the wrong side of history. Now, sure, some religious groups were on the right side of history. Absolutely. No argument. But the better biblical and religious arguments are always on the wrong side. The less rigid, the less orthodox religion, the religion that was on the correct side, was liberalized by secular ideas and values. One of the great examples of this is abolitionism. Secularism tended to drive religion towards abolition. It drove churches to examine their collective consciences. And I've got a great passage of Frederick Douglass speaking in the Founding Myth. To summarize it, he says, revivals in religion and revivals in the slave trade go hand in hand together. And again, this is a common thread through our history, right? Like even Martin Luther King Jr. recognized this. He often spoke of religion and the church as being a tail light when it ought to be a headlight. Even in his letter from the Birmingham jail, right, which we always need to remember was written to his fellow clergy. So it's counterintuitive, but it's only counterintuitive because religion is claiming that it's responsible for a lot of progress that it didn't accomplish. And there's a modern example that you can watch this starting to happen in real time. If you look at the opposition to equal marriage, it is almost exclusively religious. Again, not to say that some believers and some sects and some churches aren't on the right side of history, but the opposition to equal marriage is almost exclusively religious. And you're actually starting to see religion and some churches starting to take credit for the progress that's been made on LGBTQ rights. And I think within 40 years, we'll see how it works out. But if you pay attention and start paying attention, you will see this starting to happen.
Wow, that's very, very interesting and provocative. I've told this story before on the air, so forgive me if people are hearing this for the second time, but for the sake of our conversation, I have a friend that she's a nurse, and sometimes I go in and have a blood test. She's there taking my blood, and we talk back and forth about, the horrors that we've been enduring over the past 4 years. And as I said, she's African American. She grew up here in the South, and she's pretty much not surprised at anything that happens because of that, because of her experiences. God bless her. But I said to her, as a white, male, I said, I am so upset about what's going on and how the church has been complicit in this whole resurgence of white supremacy. And she said, honey, she grabbed my hand and just patted my hand and said, honey, when it comes to racism, the church is where the devil sits. And it was a shocking comment, but it was certainly, looking at it historically, it's true. The church does tend to bring up the rear, when it comes to transformation of society. I think we could, we would agree that there's some exceptions to that. Maybe Martin Luther King, would be one of those. Certainly part of a wider Christian tradition. However, it wasn't, white evangelical politics, certainly. And I think this Christianity in America, American Christianity, is certainly steeped in racism as it was steeped in colonialism and imperialism.
Sure. And MLK is a great example, too. I mean, but also citing him ignores what the reality was at the time, right? He's sort of who we have focused on now, 70 years after Brown versus Board. But so for instance, but during the civil rights movement itself, Jesus was also used to argue for segregation. Right. So the day after the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board, which everybody will remember integrated the nation's schools, there's a guy named Reverend Daniel out of West Dallas Church, and he delivered a sermon called God, the Original Segregationist. And he published it in pamphlet form, and it sold over 1 million copies. There's another Mississippi minister, Guy Gillespie, who published A Christian View on Segregation, which was also widely distributed and influential. Bob Jones, people probably know about his religious school, his university. He declared that segregation was scriptural in an Easter sermon. If you're against segregation and against racial separation, then you are against God. And Happy Easter. I mean, the Montgomery City Council, when they were facing the Montgomery bus boycott, said that something similar. Mixing the races is against God's creation and plan. George Wallace, in his infamous, segregation now, segregation forever speech, he talked about how we're not a government-fearing people, but a God-fearing people, and that politicians can't play at being God without faith in God, without wisdom in God. It was very much all about religion. It is a system that is the very opposite of what Christ intended, that kind of thing, right? Christianity was used to argue for segregation. And part of the problem here, I mean, is that religion is inherently divisive. It unifies only the fellow believers, the co-religionists, and it tends to turn everyone else into outsiders. And this is actually one of the reasons that the founding fathers chose to separate state and church, because religion is inherently divisive, and you mix it with government, especially a government that's supposed to rely on compromise and to function, right? You need that in a democracy. That's one of the reasons they chose to separate it. Actually, there was, I think it was last week, the AP and Religion News Service did a panel, and they were talking about churches under the new administration, the upcoming administration, and Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner explained this well. She said, religion is not that which unites, it is that which divides. And I think we tend not to conceptualize that as Americans. And part of it is that the rhetoric is often the exact opposite, especially from many of our politicians who use religion as a political cudgel. So I think remembering that religion is divisive, it helps sort of us understand why it may not have always be this force for good, and why it can end up being on two sides of the same issue often.
Now, I guess we've sort of, touched on what do Christians gain from this myth. Certainly it can be a covering for things we talked about, racism.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that's easy. It's power.
Power, I mean, exactly.
Yeah.
But what could we gain as Christians? What do you think we could gain in helping to ensure that wall of separation between state and church is inviolable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I'm an atheist. I'm not a believer. But one of the things that I think our country has forgotten and done and I think that we've not only forgotten, but probably the people working to keep state and church separate, like myself. I mean, this is what I've dedicated my law degree and career to. Probably haven't done the best job of explaining this, and that's that there is no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. If you value religious liberty, true religious liberty, you have to have as a prerequisite a secular government. Daniel Carroll, one of the few Catholic founding fathers, said something along the lines of, the rights of conscience will little bear the lightest touch of the governmental hand. And what he's getting at there is when the government weighs in on a religious issue, it is doing so on behalf of we the people, all the people. So when the government tells you it's a good day for you to pray or hosts a national day of prayer, that's not just violating the separation of state and church in the First Amendment. That's violating your religious liberty, right? It is not up to our government, which represents we the people, to tell individuals or even recommend to individuals to pray. So there is no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. That to me is the simplest way to sum it up, and perhaps the best argument for why everybody should support genuine separation between state and church. And another good reason, I think, and I think you see this very clearly in the last 4 years, is, well, let me quote James Madison here. He said that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can see what Trump has done to Christianity and be a Christian and be happy about it. You might be okay with it because you temporarily got a lot of power and you got to pack the courts, but I don't think you can really be happy about it. And certainly he's driven away, I think the demographics are going to bear this out in the next couple of years, massive numbers of people away from religion. So religion and government will both exist in greater purity unless they're mixed together. And there's no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. Those are my two big arguments for why everybody, even if you are part of the majority religion, should be in favor of state-church separation. And if those aren't convincing, look at the demographics, because in all likelihood you're not going to be part of the majority religion for long.
We even look at history, too. I mean, so often as Christians we forget our own history, Christian history and just world history. For example, the Puritan Revolution in England, 17th century, Puritans gained control of the government, and then they couldn't accomplish anything because they couldn't agree on anything because they couldn't agree what the Bible said. The only thing they were able to accomplish was to cancel Christmas because they thought it was too popish, and so that was their accomplishment, unfortunately, and it all sort of unraveled, after several years, and they went back to, albeit a constitutional monarchy, but there was some improvement there. But still, people were afterwards. Puritans were reeling and wondering. People like John Milton saying, "What was this all about? What did we do? How did it fail?" Scratching their head, trying to figure it out. That we'd been arrogant. That was one reason. But I see it as a Christian here, living in this country, that without that wall of separation, that we open ourselves up to tyranny, both Christian and non-Christian. If I could use that term. It sounds a little bit exclusive, I know, but and as a father, I want my child to be instructed in religion, but we do that at church. That's the church's responsibility. That's my responsibility as a parent. I don't want the government instructing my child in religion, because what religion? What brand of Christianity are we talking about? Maybe it's a brand that I don't particularly agree with or am not comfortable with. And usually it is. It's a brand that's usually harsher, more excluding, and maybe takes a particular interpretation of the Bible that I may not agree with. I don't want to have to go down that road. I don't have to worry about that. So being free to worship in this country and being free to follow my particular faith is important to me, without having to worry about the government, interfering in that.
And that's exactly how it preserves your freedom, right? You then get the liberty to choose what is best for you and your family without the government imposing it on you. And that's what I really am trying to get at when I'm saying that a secular government protects genuine religious liberty. And I think unless you're part, it's very easy to understand that when you're a religious minority in America or not religious. It's much harder for people to understand that as part of the majority. And I think your point about which particular brand of Christianity is going to be imposed on everybody is a very useful point to make there.
Yeah, Christianity is very diverse in its expressions. You could talk about Christianity, with a capital C, historical Christianity, and could agree upon certain, basic theology tenets with that. But then there's the local expressions and national expressions throughout history, and all are very diverse. Let's talk a little bit about your work. You work for the Center for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and certainly I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just wanted to assure our listeners that your book and your work are not there to, the purpose of them are not there to expunge Christianity from the American landscape. Although I know, as a pastor, I know and can sympathize if that ever enters your mind, but to put it in its proper place, keep it within its proper bounds.
Absolutely. It's a very common attack leveled at us. But if the government were trying to prohibit Christianity, I would be one of the first lawyers taking cases to prevent it from doing that, for sure. Even if not for my organization, I would be doing that on my own. And in fact, my next book is I just signed the contract for it, and it's tentatively titled "Weaponizing Religious Liberty," and I'm going to explain what genuine religious liberty is and has always meant, and how we're it's getting warped in the coming days. But the goal of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, it's twofold. It's to educate and to separate. So it's to educate the public about what it is to be a non-believer in the United States. There's a stigma attached to being an atheist or an agnostic or someone who doesn't go to church, right? When I was living in the South, one of the first things you get asked when you meet a new person is, which church do you go to? And people tend to think if you don't identify as a Christian, or at least not as a religious individual, that you are somehow immoral or bad. So that's one of the things we work to do, is to kind of get rid of that stigma, to educate the public about what it is to be a non-believer. And the second thing we do is we separate. We keep state and church separate. And I think a lot of our Fox News critics, would be the nice word, would point out, all we're trying to do is expunge Christianity from the public square. But no, I've taken cases where public schools are forcing kindergartners and first graders to pray before they go down to lunch to the Christian God. Jewish kids, non-religious kids, where public school administrators are letting other students beat up, bully, physically, non-religious kids, calling them witches and saying they're going to gouge out their eyes and cut off their fingers and toes, things like this. It's not just about the displays of the Ten Commandments or of the creches that are on government property. Those are important. But we're also out there fighting for the rights of every American by fighting for the separation of state and church.
Could you talk about some cases that you've had, some interesting cases that you've had recently that would illustrate what kind of work you do?
Yeah, so those cases that I did cite were actual cases we've taken in court. Another recent one we had that probably has been misunderstood is we took on a Bible class in West Virginia, and people might say, well, what's wrong with teaching the Bible? There's nothing wrong with teaching about the Bible, but you can't preach the Bible as truth in a public school. You can teach about religion, you can't preach religion. You can educate about Christianity, you can't indoctrinate Christianity. And it goes back to what you and I were talking about before. Like, this Bible class was teaching students that Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden with dinosaurs. And I don't know that all brands of Christianity agree with that. That was a successful case that we just litigated in West Virginia. But most of what we do is actually not litigating. We try to. I don't want to take a public school to federal court and spend 4 or 5 years trying to get the result that we want for the family that we're representing, right? So what we often try to do is to resolve these issues with education. So what that means is we get reports from people in the community, from people in those schools, and half the complaints that we get are from public schools. Now, this year's weird because of COVID, but in a normal year, we would get between 4,000 and 5,000 state church complaints every year, and half of those would involve the public schools. And we're not taking action on all of them, but we're sending letters oftentimes, in some years, to more than 1,000 letters to try to resolve these issues without going to court. And most of the time, we're able to do that. Right? So sometimes it's just a rogue teacher who's taking advantage of their power and the fact that they're teaching first graders or kindergartners and not expecting anybody to know that what they're doing is wrong. And we write to the superintendent, and then the superintendent steps in and does the right thing. So oftentimes we can just resolve these violations of the First Amendment to the Constitution with a simple letter and trying to educate.
Right. Now, you had quoted a recent Pew Research poll that found that 32% of Americans believe it's very important to be Christian in order to be considered truly American. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, this is to me one of the most frustrating things about the Christian nationalist rhetoric and myth, because they really are trying to co-opt and steal the American identity for their particular brand of conservative Christianity. But if you look at what is unique and original and really earth-shattering about the U.S. Constitution, it's the secular aspects of it, right? Like, it begins, "we the people." So those words are poetic, but there's so much more. They declare that power comes from the people, not gods. And that was revolutionary. That was one of the things that our Constitution did that no other written Constitution had tried to do. Our Constitution was also godless. It was the first not to mention a deity or Jesus. It was the first to ban religious tests for public office. Right there in Article 6, no religious test shall ever be required for any office or public trust under the United States. Very strong, affirmative language. No, shall, ever, any. In a document that's full of waffling language. So our federal Constitution, the American experiment, was unique because it was secular. America invented the separation of state and church. That is an American original. The idea was born in the Enlightenment, but it was first implemented in the American experiment. And I'm proud of that fact. And I wish that every citizen were proud of this American invention. And I certainly wish that far fewer were seeking to undermine it with myths about a Christian founding. But that's what we are seeing happening. So they're not just rewriting American history and the American DNA as Christian, they're erasing these really important secular contributions in the process. So it's sort of a double whammy. And one of the reasons that it's so frustrating to see that happen.
You had mentioned the Treaty of Tripoli under, I guess it was John Adams' presidency. Can you talk about that and how that reflects something of the secular nature of our founding?
Yeah, and I tried to, this is a really popular argument for secular Americans, because the Treaty of Tripoli it's very clear. It says the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Like, that is a pretty clear and bold statement. It was, and the treaty was it was signed by Adams, but it was negotiated under President Washington, and it was signed with the unanimous consent of the U.S. Senate, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, imagine the U.S. Senate today trying to sign or consent to something that says the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. There would be, I would like to see that debate, to be honest. So the interesting thing about that to me, though, is that language has been known for a long time. People, especially historians and a lot of secular Americans, certainly are familiar with that language. So I didn't want the book to depend, the founding myth, to depend on the language of this one treaty. I wanted to really dig deeper and to ask that other question: did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? And again, the answer to that is no, they didn't. So I really wanted to write a different and new book on this topic, and to do my best to make it definitive, that this is not a Christian nation, that our Constitution does not belong to the Christian nationalists, that it belongs to we the people, all of the people, and that it's about damn time that we take it back. And so that's what I really was trying to do in the founding myth. And, I've gotten a pretty good response to it so far, so I'm happy with it.
Great. Now, the book is available through Amazon, other
book is available everywhere. If you want to support your local bookstore but don't want to go there because it's a pandemic, I recommend bookshop.org. It's a great way you can buy from your local bookstore through this one website. It makes it really easy. Of course, feel free to get it on Amazon. If anybody is looking for a signed copy, which tends to make a great gift for the holidays, we figured out a way to do that. So if you go to the Freedom from Religion Foundation website, we have a shop on there. So if you go to ffrs.org, if you just buy a copy through there, it'll be signed. And if you would like a personalized note, you can leave there's a little comment section when you're checking out of the store. You can leave a little note that says, make it out to SJ from Andrew, and then I will do that. It takes a little longer, obviously, to get that, but that way people can at least get a signed copy of it, since we had to cancel all the bookstores all year. So
that's great. So if you're looking for a great Christmas gift or stocking stuffer, buy Andrew Seidel's book, The Founding Myth. Andrew Seidel, thank you so much for being on the show today, and we wish you well in your work and in your publishing career. Good luck with your next book as well.
Thank you so much, SJ. I appreciate you taking the time. It was a fun conversation, and I feel like we could have gone for another hour easily. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can have you back another time.
Sounds good.
Okay. You take care and have a wonderful holiday season.
You too. Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in. And this is S.J. Munson signing off.